Yeah, trying to figure out how to get the thumbnails to be better than they are, because you don't want to see my face all the time. That's not the useful part here. But yeah, this is the design I'm roughly going with for the board. Um, as I was talking about yesterday with the board design, one of the things I was playing with was uh, a main part of the board where you have a U-shaped track, and then a top piece that slots onto it to finish off the track into a loop, and then have it so that the next time around you can turn over that middle piece and have a longer track for an expansion of the game. I'm so close to it. But so part of the design aspect I want to do for this is that I guess it's sort of cliche at this point, but that's not going to stop me from using it. Is the sci-fi settings oftentimes have the hexagonal, geometric, almost beehive-like structures on them, especially in like user interfaces and stuff like that. And I feel like um, if I make the game board a hexagon, and then the bottom part of the board, the longer U-shaped portion of the board, being something that just makes it an elongated hexagon, it means that if I do that same shape for a second board, if you put it right on top, it makes it even a longer hexagon, but it still remains a hexagon. But the beauty of this is, as they fit together, as they're slotted together like this, you have a point that goes into the divot that fits it just right. But it also allows you to use the points in a trilogy of pieces, I think. And that in and of itself makes it possible for the board to be um, three different sections of a city surrounding a certain place in the hub, and playing around with the designs of this further on. If you did the stacked two ones like this, you can actually do a second board right next to it, a second set of boards right next to it that would tile together and give you an even bigger gridded out city shape. And so it gives you the opportunity to combine aspects of these cityscapes in ways that give you a different city each time you do it. And if each one of these boards had, I mean, you don't have to at this point, but like if each one of those boards had different artwork, so three different pieces of artwork on the fronts, flip them over, three different pieces of artwork on the backs, the combinations you can do with that expand how far you can stretch that out. And if you have, um, more than um, like this makes it possible to actually end up tiling them in such a way that you could have 20 or 30 people playing individual games in areas and groups that weave in and out of each other, and you trade players between groups on a massive cityscape. And I was like, I don't know if that's practical or even something that would ever happen, but making it so that it could if somebody wanted it to, yeah, I'm gonna do that. I'm totally gonna do that. And when I was playing around with the design and seeing that if you tiled them in the trio set, there are little triangles that appear between them, and there are other ways to set them up in trios. There's one where you have three hexagon centers um, around three elongations of those hexagons, forming a larger sort of triangle looking space. but in the middle of that triangle is an empty triangle. So when you do a trio in the way I showed here, the delta formation that they make, um, and you tile them right next to each other, they're small triangle gaps that match that gap in the middle of that triangle shaped arrangement. And so there's space for including a different type of tile at a future point. And with those tile expansions, maybe throw in some additional rules for rule gameplay that expand gameplay past the player versus player, player versus corporation concepts that the original mechanics embody most of the time. And for what I'm going for at this point, this seems to work really well as a, like, if we start with the main board being the hexagon with the elongation of the board into a single loop, gameplay on that, I think I talked about before, maybe doing like a 3-act type of gameplay, where game one that you can play with that kind of set is a competitive game of individual street cyberpunk hacker kids, or whatever you want to call them, securing access to the systems of major corporations. And part of it would be something like you have a person contracting you to secure some of those, and the one who secures one of each type by the end of the game is the winner of that round. And then set it up so that there's a cooperative gameplay, or act two, in which one of these corporations has gotten grossly oversized and very corrupt, and it's the goal of the hacker individuals from round one, or just a new game, for them to work together to stop the overpowered, corrupt organization from gaining more power. And then there's an aspect of something along that same line of thought that you can do in either the single board, double, or triple board arrangement, that you can do a game where, and this one really, I like, I think this is going to be the best way to do the betrayal mode. The betrayal mode is something that I was debating, like, what's the mechanic? Do you do like some of those games where everybody closes their eyes at the beginning of the game, and then only one person who has received a marker opens their eyes and sees if, like you might have two people who are betrayers, and they see each other and they have to work together to try to, like, that mechanic isn't, I don't think, works for this game, not in this style. But I do think I found a mechanic that may work for this. And it's a little tricky because it's less like you have the role of betrayer. You're not assigned the role, but at a certain point in the game, a piece of mechanic will subtly let you know you have the option not to lose with everybody else. Like, if it looks like you might be in a situation where the game can go either way, here's an option. And when everybody else is failing, you don't have to worry because you're covered. Just so long as you agree to be with, you don't act, you could do it without actively doing anything to sabotage anybody else. It just means that when everybody else loses, you don't. All it requires is that you acknowledge that you're willing to be the traitor. And it was just sort of like, ooh, that is a brutal, like, because you don't actively have to do anything that hurts anybody else. You don't have to try to lose. But you have the option of, well, if I don't do anything and the team fails anyway, I don't have to fail or die or whatever with them. And I was like, that's like, it's easier to swallow. Like, you're not actively hurting other players around you. You're just refusing to be taken down with them. It's sort of like the police interrogation kind of tactic where, like, they bring you off into a room and they tell you, look, if you roll over on these other guys, you could walk. We could make some kind of deal with you where you don't serve time in jail. Maybe you do parole for 6 years or whatever, or whatever you want to consider it. But if you roll over on the others, we can make something happen for you. And then there's the added trick of, like, you're not the only one this deal is being offered to. Knowing during gameplay that you get this offer at some point and you're sort of like, I don't know if I want to do that. But the realization that, like, you're not the first one this offer has come to, and you you may not be the only one who gets the offer, even if you take it. So it's possible that one of the others is already going to sabotage the game. Like, you don't have to actively do it, but if they have a vested interest in the game not going uh, well for everybody else, does it make sense to stand on those principles and go down with everybody else? Or do you maybe just hold on to what you need to make sure you win regardless? And so it's just like, oh, that's a harsh way to do that. And it's perfect for a cyberpunk setting. Like, in a game where information and access to influence are key factors of this dystopian world, knowing that somebody else has the opportunity to betray the team and knowing that you get access to victory for doing nothing other than cooperating, that's, yeah, that's just, so I think that mechanic is going to work really, really well. I've got the board design. I did some calculations. Like, this is where, like, in game design portion of things, the math starts to kick in. I was looking at the possible corporation combinations. Was it yesterday or the day before where I was playing around with the idea? Like, I have in the 6 categories: the telecom, control, transport, energy, finance, and goods companies. And I figure having 2 telecom companies, 3 control companies, 3 transport, 3 energy, 5 finance, and 5 goods gives me about 21 um, possible corporations to roll through. And if you need one of each, the limit on, if you have 6 players playing your first game with you, nobody's going to, like, it's entirely possible that uh, there's going to be some pretty fierce battles to see who can get whichever ones they need to get a complete set. You can get a complete set, you can get 2 complete sets, but past that you can't. So eventually it's probably going to come down to player versus player, one versus another, and the others will have fallen by the wayside, but not out of the game yet, because they can still attack the 2 people who have the telecoms and take them back. And so it can become a brutal fight, and things could change hands. Eventually, you're going to have a situation where somebody can have all of them, and then their goal is to get back to the client who's hiring you guys to acquire access to these different megacorps. Now, in a oh god, my ear is driving me nuts. Okay, and then I was talking about last night, I think, where we were looking at duos. So, like, instead of just having a telecom and a control company, you have a control telecom company and a control finance and an energy transportation company. And I feel like for the first game, having just a telecom, just a control, just a transport, just the basic ones to start with is the way to go. The expansion can have the duos, especially if you're doing a like a story mode 2, where the like a act 2 style story, it gives you room to move from one small neighborhood part of the city, Chinatown or something like that. Um, and like when you're expanding into another territory like that, uh, you have the possibility of like you're moving from uh, small borough Chinatown telecom company to a energy telecom conglomerate that works over two territories. And then as you get bigger and bigger, you have like more of those combined. I don't know if I'll ever get out to the point where you start getting like multi conglomerate of like telecom control energy finance corporations as a general rule. But I mean, there's room to grow into that if we want to get to that point at some point. I think if you're going to do that, it changes one of like the goal mechanics where like in game one, if the goal is to acquire a telecom, a control, transport, energy, finance, and goods company, as the board gets bigger, there are more players, there's more turf to cover. It makes sense to go for a control finance and an energy goods company. Um, it gets you to what you need faster, um, because there's going to be a lot more moving, a lot more confrontation, and it's going to make the game run longer. So cutting it shorter by making it possible to get what you need, two of what you need in one fell swoop, makes more sense. Um, but there is a threshold of return where if you start having a telecom energy goods transport company, like you really only need two at that point to meet the qualifier of having one of each. So I think if you're going to get to a game where you're going to get to that level of acquisition, that you have to add or remove some portion of the mechanics. Um, Maybe at some point the motivation isn't to acquire one of each. Maybe the goal is to, add a mechanic at another point where you can exchange them for currency and buy bonus cards that give your player character a advantage on the field in some way. It's just like I don't know where that would go. I haven't figured that far out, but this is far enough to get you through three tiers of types of gameplay. So, but I'm not ruling out expansion in those directions, and so like it being a possibility means that this game has growth potential. It has the ability to grow past its current format, um, and like now I'm really kind of hitting the point where like there's I've got the value of the cards. I've got the number of cards roughly for each one. Um, the values, like, I'm going to have to see how they go through play testing. And I won't be able to play test them tonight, but I should be able to play test tomorrow, hopefully. I'm going to put some feelers out to see if I can do some play testing over the next couple of nights. I know a couple people who may be willing to play a game with me tomorrow. And then maybe Sunday or Monday. I mean, I know I'm pushing the edge at that point, um, but once I get a sense of like, I want to be able to at least once try cooperative, potentially with a betrayal mechanic in there, um, and once play competitive mode. Make sure that all the movements seem to be happening relatively well. Nothing's really breaking as I go. I mean, most of these mechanics are things I'm familiar with from other games, so they sort of match up with things I know have worked in the past. It's more about whether or not the way I'm combining them break how they work. Because I've not encountered a game that's done exactly the way I'm doing it. All the pieces have worked in previous games. The question is, do they work together well now? And I'm not seeing anything that can go grossly wrong, but again, the biggest thing I think right now there's going to be a difficulty is the combat and motion aspects. Whether or not there's enough of each value for those to maintain a well balanced play. And then after that, it's really all down to design. I've got my rough designs for the board shape. I've got I've got the shape the boards need to be. I've got the designs I want the paths to follow on the board. And I've got the basic positioning of where I want the Megacorp sites to be. And I've got the basic design I want to use for the Megacorp tiles. I have to figure out how to design the art for the cards to make them look interesting. I think the big element of the design of the board that I'm going back and forth on is how far to the edge of them do I want to make the city illustration go? Because like the basic outline of what I want to do is make the main shape of the board and have the tiles or the squares that the player moves around in the arrangement it needs to be on, but have certain squares. In this case, it would probably be hexagons on that path large enough that I can use them as the sinking point of the corporation cards, that they just slot into those locations. And my original feeling for how to design that was going to be to do a regular black board edge with some illustration, some artwork for it, and then the path that the player follows with slots to slide in those cards for corporations. And then in the center of those is the city map. But if I'm building these so that you can tile them together into a larger city, then I want the city illustration to go all the way to the edge. I want the edge to be something that tiles with other board pieces. It's possible that I could do in the center of the path where the characters travel to do a park or a monument of something with the game art in it. And one of the other things I'm working around with is that center hexagon. setting it up so that, like, I don't know. I think I can set it up where it's just a hexagon with a hexagonal path around it, that the players have to travel to get to the main building in that hexagon. And if I do that, yeah, I think if I set it up where there's like a main entrance, and depending on how I orient that entrance, um, like if I have it pointing away from the rest of the board, you have to go around the top to get to that entrance. But later on, um, if you have multiple boards connected to one another, you can have it pointing off in another direction, one of those other points where everybody still has to travel along the outside of that hexagon to get to that entrance. Some less distance than others, but I think that makes more sense. Because I was originally thinking about taking that center tile and make it something you have to flip over to get a different arrangement of path. Because originally it was, if you remember from, I think it was yesterday, um, the putting the tile across the top would give you the second half of the loop to close it. And then if you wanted to do two boards end to end, it would be a different tile. So like the back of that one would be bridges from left to left, right to right. Um, and then if you wanted to put three together, you would have a separate tile, a triangle. That would be just the corners of the triangle taken off to close the loop into one giant loop. But if it's already just a single loop and you could travel any way you want around that loop, but the entrance is always requiring you to at least move around. It's not like immediately right there when you get to that hexagonal tile. I mean, it's going to be closer for some people, but I think the other thing about doing the whole loop around the hexagon always being available is it means that you can stay in one neighborhood and just do loops in your neighborhood, and then loops in that adjoining neighborhood as separate loops. You don't have to go all the way around the clover to get around the whole set once. Um, so it allows some choice being made about how far you're going to venture out and where your territory of coverage is going to be. I think that makes the most sense. I don't think it breaks anything other than not making you run three tracks instead of the one loop that you could get done faster if you wanted to just stick with your small little neighborhood. And you think just running that loop over and over again will get you somewhere faster than running two loops or three loops altogether. um, so, like, I think the cityscape running to the edge of the boards and the path being taken on the hexagon being a complete loop in and of itself. I think the important thing for that loop to be uh, aware of is there right now, and I don't know if it's going to be relevant or the way I do it from now on, but it has to run through playtesting. I'm pretty sure it's the part that makes sense where it is. But there are certain tiles that you land on that let you draw a card. And when you draw a card, it increases your choice and opportunities for movement. So having enough of those around the board is important so that somebody's just not stuck sitting in a sitting duck. Um, but I think it's also important to maybe do a once per turn draw a card, because if we're using these cards for attack and motion, they become very, very useful, and you'll run out of them quickly. Like, you don't want to get to a point where you don't have the ability to move and you can't land on a draw a card slot if you can't move. There has to be a way to get a can't a draw a card at some point. That's an interesting situation. So each turn you get a card no matter what. Um, yeah. I mean, I can see circumstances in which you overspend in your combat mode against corporations. You've got the corporations, but you can't move. You're a sitting duck. But it's also possible that if you have enough cards to move, but you keep playing them and you don't land on a draw a card spot, you have to have another means of getting a card on a regular basis. And so, like, drawing a card every turn means that at least every turn you can move whatever you draw. Like, minimum would be one space. So that, I think that's important. But I do think if we're going to do that, um, that hexagon in the middle, I don't think it should be possible for you to just loop around that hexagon as many times as you want and hit draw card symbols every time you loop around. I think that hexagon in the middle should have no draw card ending spots, so that if you're going to move around it, you're going to burn a handful of cards, and you're only going to get one free draw every turn. And then there was the mechanic I was playing with earlier on about sort of the rock, paper, scissors arrangement between different stores, not stores, companies, and how you can potentially make some, like the spoofing card, that mechanic that I was trying to include earlier. I still want to keep it in there because I think it does offer an opportunity. Like, if you have a spoofing card and you have very little motion left, if you have like two cards, you have a 3 or a 4 card and another 3 card, and there's a corporation on your right. If you go into the corporation and you play your spoofing card, it gives you the opportunity to move to a completely different corporation, but only ones that are on the same line. And building that line was based off of like the rock paper scissors arrangement. Like, with rock paper scissors, like, there's, rock breaks scissors, but scissors cut paper, but paper covers rock. If you do the rock paper scissors lizard Spock arrangement, two things hurt lizard, but lizard hurts two things. And you can do that for any number of things, but they have to be an odd number. So you can do 3, 5, 7, which makes the most sense for this one. I'm sorry, that was an inappropriate choice of finger. So you can do 7, 7 points. And so for that, in this game, I think, like, having each each corporation spot where a corporation tile slots in being one of 6 locations, and then like your home base, the place you have to return to when you've completed your mission to acquire one of each category, being spot 7. I think that makes sense. And if you do that, where 0.7 is the center tile, it means that if you expand to 2 boards off that center tile, you have 2 boards that interconnect at that center tile, and it enables you to go from board 1 to center tile to board 2 in 2 moves. Whereas you would have to potentially walk 2 or 3 turns worth of walking on the path to get there. And once you're on board 2, if you have more spoofing cards, you can spoof from one place on board 2 all the way to another place on board 2, and travel massive amounts of distances in a more effective manner. So I do think that's still super valuable as a mechanic. Making the paths more obvious, like it made my whole diagram of what my tiles were supposed to look like, the board's supposed to look like, made it look like a bunch of scribbles, because it just covers it with a mess. So I need to work on the better way to draw that out. But I think it's a workable mechanic. What else do I really need to try out? I think it's just the play testing. Make sure the cooperative mode works, the betrayal mode works, the competitive mode works. Make sure we've got the right mechanic for making sure everybody has enough cards to keep moving and nobody's left standing still too long. And make sure that the motion card, combat card, numbering, and value systems are suitable to what I'm doing. Now, I would like to keep the total card number 50 or under, maybe 52 under. So if you really want to, you could use a $1 dollar store playing card deck as your base for doing this. But that that's contingent on that working out well in playtest. If playtest says that'll work, then that's what I'll do. But if playtest says you cycle through the cards way too fast, people need much bigger hands of cards. And like if you've got 6 players, 10 cards per hand exceeds what you would be able to do. But is 5 cards per player's hand enough? You're going to cycle through that deck fast. And roughly 16 of those cards are not movement cards. They're things that happen to you. And so if you had basically the cards that are movement / combat cards, there's roughly 30 to 35 of those. 30 plus 16 gets me, I think that's 45. Why won't you acknowledge when I tap a key? Trying to do the counting here and find out what it is I really set up. The way I got it right now, it's about 46 cards. I could throw in an extra 4, not too hard to do. And that would get you an even 50. If I threw in an extra 6 cards, that would get you 52 for a deck of cards. And 52 cards, if you have 6 players, okay, so 52 cards minus 16 divided by 6 gets you 6 cards per player max. And if you're doing that, that leaves the draw pile almost exclusively problem cards. So, like, you kind of want to be in a situation where no player has more than 3 cards on a regular basis. But if you do that, it makes it less likely that a player will hold on to a card that's useful, like a spoofing card, or a DDoS card, or an escape corpsec card, or a defend yourself card. I mean, there's also the theft from another player card. Yeah, I may end up having to do 100 cards for a deck. So 2 decks for gameplay. Because that's too much of a number, a number limitation. 6 card hands, that's really tight for 6 players for one board. Well, I'll have to play test it. I'll have to see if that's doable. Because I've played a few games that have a mechanic like that, and you don't usually run up like a 10 card hand. You usually run it around at about 3 or 4 cards per hand. Because you're using them, they're useful. You do stuff with them. But and if I set the player limit to a 5-player or a 4-player for one board game, and then for subsequent additional boards, if you do 2 boards, then yeah, a second deck of cards that goes right with it, absolutely. Suddenly you have that 104 cards to use. That might work. So I have to play test at 50 cards. See how well that works out. My first playtest is going to likely be less than 5 players, so it may work out fine that way. I'd be curious to see how many players max you could end up if you just kept stacking that way. I feel like you could probably get to a point where you could have tiled 12 boards and well over 20 players. But that kind of game is going to run you a whole day minimum. It's just going to be a really long, convoluted game. And I don't know what the win scenario for that large a group would be. I mean, you can run them as intertwining individual group games of 5 to 7 players. Easily make that work, but like when you have your local cluster, well, I mean, it opens up the mechanic to having like a group of 5 people playing, and as that game starts to go south and one of those players isn't going to be a winner, they may depart that section of the board and find another group of players that they can jump in with. And it's like in mid play too. So yeah, I mean, it has some potential for that. I don't know what the long-term implications of joining games in the middle of it with different groups and swapping teams and all that. Like, I don't know how that gradually affects things, and I don't know what the end hope is for a player at that point. Like, is everybody playing for ultimately being king of the hill of all of them, like one major winner? I don't know. I mean, could you do a cluster of people doing a competitive and a cluster doing a cooperative? I don't know. That's See, there's a lot of playtest potential in here. I won't be able to do all of it before I release it through a website, um, but I will do enough that it's a playable game, possibly 2 or 3 different types of playable games on the same theme with the same mechanics, and then leave room for that expansion of capability for later. Okay, so yeah, that's sort of where I am right now on that. I think over the next day I'll do some play testing, but I'll also bang out a mock-up board. I want to try to do some digital art uh, for the game over the next couple days. So I can do like build the boards in like GIMP or Inkscape, and do the tiles for the corporations likewise, and card art. I don't know how I'm going to do the card art. If I really want to put them like a pastable artwork that I can do on the face of playing cards, that might work. Ultimately, I think it would be fun to be able to put it up on one of the game websites where you can order print-on-demand games. But I mean, at that point, this game's going to be at minimum $50 for the base game, and for an expansion pack is probably going to be another $50. So it's going to be for like the trio board game set. You're talking like close to $200 by the end of it. Oh, and I also had like I realized when I was dabbling with this idea all day today and playing around with ideas in my head, I'm like, I've got designs for almost like the shape and rough outline of what I want all the pieces to look like. And then I'm like, all right, I haven't given much thought to the individual players' board in front of them, the board that keeps track of what they've accumulated, the corporations they've accumulated access to, and like where they keep their hand of cards, and potentially a tracker for group affiliation, and I've been playing around with a mechanic for each corporation to offer a bonus. So like a transportation corporation might give you an automatic 1 square or 2 square additional movements per turn. And a telecom corporation may actually give you a bonus to attack values per attack. Um, so having those be markers on the corporations that you accumulate, and having those sort of uh, arrayed around the player's plaque. I don't know what else to call it. It's the player's board. Like each player gets their own board off of which they stack their accumulated corporations, and then there's the main play board, and then the hexagonal centerpiece, and the cards, and so it's just like each player should have a small board for themselves too. And it's like, just so we know how much I've been banging my head against this and like being somewhat vague on my awareness. One of the things that came across my brain at one point was like, so how am I going to build this player board? Like, you need to have a place where you can slot in 6 different uh, 6 different corporations if you want to get one of each by the end of the first gameplay type. So what kind of design should it like? Duh, a hexagon. It has 6 faces. You just slot them up against it. It's not that hard. So yeah, my brain's just kind of like, what? Of course. Why wouldn't I? What? Just why? Why was it that hard for me to figure that out? So, yeah, that's roughly designed out for like put your deck of cards here. Um, the corporations you accumulate here, maybe faction indicator. So if you want to do like teaming up, like if you want, you could do it as in a competitive game. You could make alliances of 2 players out of 6 players forming an alliance to work together, and being able to say, yeah, we're members of the same crew, mercenary group or a gang of hacker punks, whatever you want to do. Um, like being able to have a faction, like it's not as important in gameplay one, but for Act Two, where you may have multiple people and be doing a cooperative play or pseudo cooperative play, where you have cooperative play, but 2 competitive teams cooperatively playing. Um, and then, like, once you get to the point of massive scale gameplay of 20 or 30 people with 5 or 6 boards out there, the possibility of doing factions is interesting. And I don't know how it's mechanically going to work out fully yet, but making a single spot on each player's board possible for a faction category um, is doesn't hurt to include that in there. Maybe like a wallet. Like there may come a point where you exchange corporations for funds to buy upgrades or other gameplay mechanics yet to be introduced. And so maybe having a wallet, not a bad idea. All right. So the player card is one I have not actually fully designed out yet. But yeah, it's for the most part for game mechanics, for game Act 1, 2, and 3 setups. It really just needs to be a place where you can anchor the corporations you've seized and maybe set your deck or your hand. So I'll try out the gameplay in the next couple days. I need to do up the artwork of the cityscape, the path that the characters follow, card art. But other than that, I think I'm pretty much there. And I, I could go simple, very simple with the artwork. But I kind of want to be very stylistic and interesting. It is just a first draft, though. So, like, as long as it's playable and has some theme to the basic design of it, I think that's pretty good. Not sure what else I need to do. I think that's everything locked up. Like, mainly just figuring out, like, the cards. Make sure the card and motion mechanic work out tomorrow. And any little tweaks I need to do. Like the smoothing works out. It's just the size of the deck. Yeah, I think that's really it. Just size of the deck is the main factor right now to play with. Make sure I leave a little wiggle room for additional mechanics later on. I think that's everything. For 54 minutes. I'm going to call it here tonight. I will see you tomorrow, hopefully with I'll see if I can bring out a non-paper and pencil board. I will see if I can mock up a better one by tomorrow for playtesting. And show that off and discuss any things I learned in playtesting. But all right, see you tomorrow and take care of yourselves.